Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
Christian Zionism is an important pillar of American support for Israel. To better understand this, we speak with Daniel Hummel today. Daniel is a historian of U.S. religion. He is the director of the Lumen Center for the Study of Christianity and Culture in Madison, Wisconsin, and a research fellow in the history department of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Daniel, it's great to have you as our guest. Thank you so much for being on our show today.
It's a pleasure and looking forward to the conversation.
So, most Jewish people know what Jewish Zionism is. It is the ideology and movement for the return of the Jewish people to its ancestral homeland and to have a sovereign Jewish state there. Can you tell us in short what Christian Zionism is and some of its history in the United States?
Sure. Christian Zionism really wouldn't be that much different in terms of what you just described as Zionism, except that it is reliant on, you could say, Christian theological and biblical arguments to get to supporting the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and a sovereign state of Israel. So in Christian Zionist circles, you tend to see arguments around particularly theological concepts that are unique to Christianity, as opposed to shared by, say, Jews and Christians or anyone else. Christian Zionism as an idea or a concept has a long history in Christianity. Many people trace it at least back to the Reformation, when you get the Protestant and Catholic divide in Christianity. And ever since then, that would have been the 16th century. So we're talking about like the last 500 years. There have been marginal voices within Christianity, particularly Protestant Christianity, who have argued for what we've been talking about, the return of Jews to their homeland and a sovereign state of Israel, based on a few different arguments. One of them has been around prophecy, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, Christian interpretations of biblical prophecy. And another one, more recent in the 20th century, in response to the Holocaust and some Christians' recognition of Christian theological complicity in the Holocaust, has been a desire by some Christians to rectify past wrongs by supporting Zionism. And that's a particular Christian argument about Christian history and the response of Christians today, that there's a sort of a burden on Christians today. Both of those arguments, the prophecy one and the one around Christian history, are ones that you see today in Christian Zionist circles now.
So, um, um, it wants the same thing, is what I understand from you, if I'm correct. It wants the same thing as Jewish Zionism, which is a Jewish state in the ancestral homeland of the Jews. Is that correct?
Yeah, particularly in practical terms, sort of what are Christian Zionists advocating for when it comes to politics and U.S. policy? Those align pretty closely between at least a lot of Jewish Zionists and Christian Zionists. In the more theological, conceptual realm, there are differences. And because it's Christian Zionism, there are sort of, particularly Christian prophecy or interpretation of biblical prophecy, there are Christian expectations about the end times that diverge significantly from most Jewish expectations. And so there are differences, for sure. One distinction that might be helpful is between Christian Zionism as a sort of set of ideas that is, I mean, it's even an ism, right? So it's like communism or fascism or any other ism, in the sense that there's an abstract set of ideas that we call Christian Zionism. There's also what we might call the Christian Zionist movement. So the actual embodied organizations, money, people who are active on this topic. And in the Christian Zionist movement, while many of them hold to these ideas that mean they have a particular view of the end times and other things, the way their organizations work often is to align as closely as they can with what they understand to be Israel's state interests, and so then there is not nearly as much daylight between Christian and Jewish Zionists. At least, and it of course depends on the Israeli government in power and other things as well. But many Christian Zionists would want to emphasize the practical similarities between what they want and what Jewish Zionists want. But yes, we can spend time also on the differences,
We
particularly I would
will.
say around the end times and also around this question of missions.
We
Uh,
will.
yeah,
We
okay.
will. We will
Sounds good.
later on. But for just for my clarity and maybe of also of other people, it Christian Zionism doesn't mean that Christians want to move to Israel to live there. That's not the objective.
No, that
Or
is
is
not
it?
the objective.
No.
There's a small group of Christians who do that. By small, it's probably, under in the thousands, but not more than that over the history of the last couple hundred years. Most Christian Zionists are eager to see Jews return to the Promised Land, not to see Christians go there.
Okay. All right.
How big is the Christian Zionist movement in America?
Yeah, this is always a hard question to answer because it depends on the poll question you ask, and it depends also if you're limiting yourself to evangelical Christianity,
Mm.
which tends to be the area today that is most popular with Christian Zionism. We know from the biggest organization that claims to be Christian Zionist in the U.S., Christians United for Israel. It's about 20 years old. They claim to have 11 million members in their registers. They're the largest. They're certainly not the only one. There are hundreds of much smaller organizations across the country. So you can roughly estimate that there are, between 10 and 20 million uh, uh, Americans who would be sort of strongly on polling in favor of Christian Zionist positions. There's a smaller group of those who are actually active and either sort of actively lobbying or working in one of these organizations than that. But if you think about polling around how many evangelicals there are, there's anywhere between 60 and 80 million evangelicals. So you're talking about a big subset of evangelicals respond positively to and but when I mean polling, I mean like questions like is the land that God promised to Israel in the Bible still is still the covenanted land of the Jewish people. Those types of polls, we know that a majority of evangelicals respond positively in those types of questions. And if you build enough of those questions together, you can sort of lean into the idea that they're Christian Zionist based on their beliefs. But the term Christian Zionism isn't used in churches usually. Like that's not a term that people self-identify as. It's much more a term that journalists and scholars and others use to try to describe this large group, certainly tens of millions strong, who have theological or biblical interpretation arguments to support Israel.
Okay.
What would you call it? What do they call themselves?
Pro-Israel evangelicals, supporters of Israel. I mean, some of them, because it's so obvious to them, they'll just say, I'm a Bible-believing Christian. And the subtext there is that a Bible-believing Christian is one who supports Israel or has these theological convictions. So they wouldn't, the term Christian Zionist came about in the 80s and was used largely around activism with this issue. But those deeper theological ideas that lead to it are things that most evangelicals think come out of just a faithful reading of the Bible and are not attached to a certain system of thought. That's one of the ways evangelicals can be confusing to those outside is they don't want to attach any of their beliefs to tradition or to sort of a larger orientation in the world. They want to say that these are commonsensical, obvious readings of the text. So they'll want to root them in those types of ways of talking than by identifying with a certain tradition of thinking.
So we're talking about tens of millions of Americans who believe in Zionism, actually, is
Of
what you're
Christian
saying.
Americans, yeah, of
Yes.
Americans who do for Christian reasons, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. So on a total population of about 350 million, including kids, um, that's a big portion, I would say. What is the impact on Israel, the positive impact on Israel, and on the relationship between America and Israel of this group of Christian believers?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to think about that. One is just the pure political way or diplomatic way. And those organizations like Christians Unite for Israel really have had a significant influence on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. They've been so the founder of that is a guy named John Hagee. He's a pastor in Texas. He's been pretty significant advisor to Donald Trump, both in Trump's first term and in the current administration, and has been credited for getting things like moving the embassy to Israel to Jerusalem on the top of Trump's to-do list. So you really see some political clout. There have been other people that we call Christian Zionists. Again, I don't know if they call themselves this, but people like Mike Pence, like Mike Huckabee. Mike Huckabee certainly would call himself a Christian Zionist. He's very
Who's now going to be the ambassador
Yes,
yes.
for the U.S. in Israel?
That's
Okay.
right. So, and he's been in this sort of space since the 70s. So he's been really active a long time. So there are some actual political people in government who are Christian Zionist, and then there are really important pastors and organizational leaders who are as well. And I would say there's no group that determines foreign policy with Israel, but Christian Zionists are a very significant player in the Republican Party. Almost every Republican hopeful for the presidency back in 2016 spoke at Christians United for Israel's large summer events the summer before the primaries happened. It's become sort of an important stop for politicians in the Republican Party. And so that's the political side. On the more public side, Christian Zionists tend to tour Israel in large numbers. Some of these are explicitly political tours. Some of them are just religious tours that have some sort of political valences to them. We know that hundreds of thousands of evangelicals go to Israel in a normal year. It's been some strange years recently, but in a normal year, hundreds of thousands of evangelicals go there. Of course, contribute to the Israeli economy in that way. And also bring back some pretty strong impressions, and they become, you could think, like early adopters or advocates for thinking about Israel in more positive terms. And then there's been also a lot of, you could say, exchange between evangelical academics at evangelical colleges and universities and Israeli academics in Israeli colleges and universities. And one of the more practical effects of that has been an increasingly active interreligious dialogue between Christian theologians and Jewish theologians that has done some really influential work for how Christians, evangelical Christians in particular, talk about Israel and Jews. That is frankly just a massive change from even 50 years ago. Some of this is about Holocaust remembrance and sort of fronting that in the relationship. Some of it is about this idea of replacement theology being a problem for Christians. The idea that in the way Christians tend to read the Bible is that God replaced the nation of Israel with the church as his chosen people. And this was seen as a major problem with the way Christians then understood Jews in the modern day. And this academic exchange between evangelical academics and Israeli Jewish academics has been one of the things that has pushed a sort of reform in the way Christians talk about Israel to get rid of replacement theology. So there's a bunch of different levels that evangelicals relate to Israel and sort of influence the way Americans think about Israel. But you can think about this on the political, on an academic or intellectual, and then also on a cultural level with tourism and other things.
Right.
What was
So you mentioned the Holocaust twice now.
Yeah.
Um, Earlier in this interview, you said it's a little bit of a burden
Mhm.
on the Christian Zionist movement, and you just mentioned that in the Jewish Christian dialogue, there has been a change in how Christians talk or deal with the Holocaust. Could you further explore that, please? And I'm very interested in it personally because my father and my uncle, and also the rest of their direct family, have survived the Holocaust in the Netherlands because they were hidden by very brave evangelical Christians who did it pure for religious reasons. They wanted to save Jews
Right.
from the Nazis. So could uh, could you
Right.
please explore
Right.
more of that?
So some of the way this interpretation emerges is actually evangelicals absorbing other Christian thinkers after the Holocaust. So after the Holocaust, there's of course debates about why it happened
Hmm.
among scholars of religion in particular. Some scholars blame it more on Nazi ideology, and this is sort of a pagan, anti-Semitism is a modern racist ideology, all that kind of stuff. There's another subset of scholars who say, no, actually, there's a long tradition of what they would call a teaching of contempt for the Jewish people that goes all the way back really to the early church, maybe even into the Bible. That's often debated. Is the Gospel of John, for example, perpetuating an anti-Jewish view of Jews back then, and the for the scholars who do see a very long history of this, they then interpret the Holocaust not just as an atrocity committed by Nazis, but an atrocity committed by confessing Christians. Like most of the soldiers that manned the death camps were also members of the Lutheran or Catholic Church in Germany, and really asking what role did Christian theology play in, if not sort of fronting those ideas, allowing those racist ideas to be accepted by the broader populace and actually accepted alongside their Christianity. So this is a debate in the 50s and 60s by Christian scholars, largely in the U.S. Franklin Littell is a really important name here. He ended up founding the first Holocaust Studies department in the country at Temple University. He was a pastor before he was an academic. And evangelicals pick this up, and in the 60s mostly, at least they start. Some of them do, the ones who are interested in this. And they end up sort of internalizing this and realizing that they interpret that, yes, actually, a lot of European Christianity was anti-Jewish, if not anti-Semitic, in the early 20th century. And one of the ways, and it led to the Holocaust, one of the ways we can correct that and make sure that that doesn't happen again in our corner of the church is to be as Zionist as we can be within our Christian tradition. Some of this is just a pure like reparations type talking, like Christians committed this sin, we want to try to rectify it. Other people talk more about just a more conceptual theological shift where we really want to guard against the anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish tendencies of earlier Christian theology, and we want to make sure that our theology is what they would say is more biblical, which would be more pro-Jewish. And they happen to be doing this at the same time that the Second Vatican Council is meeting and reforming some of the ways Catholics talk about Jews and Israel as well. And so they're not alone in doing this, but some of them take it into the political activist sphere and really make it part of the Christian Zionist rhetoric as well. And so today, when you go to a Christians Unite for Israel rally, for example, you will hear guarding against anti-Semitic theology as sort of one of the main reasons why Christians Unite for Israel exists, is to do that. So it is to support Israel, it's to lobby for certain policies, it's also to police the Christian world and make sure, from their perspective, that these bad theologies don't emerge again in the present day.
Can you give us an example of what Christian Zionists might be doing on universities today to push back against the blatant anti-Semitism?
Well, Christians Unite for Israel has a student wing to its work. So it has chapters all across the country
Mm.
that are sort of like any other student organization. They get some central organizing from the organization, but otherwise they're based on the campus. Some of the stuff they've done in the last, since October 7th, 2023 in particular, are link up with Jewish groups on those, like the Hillel here, for example, at UW, so that the pro-Israel protests aren't just Jewish students, that there is a sort of diverse religious representation. Another thing that Christians United for Israel has been really passionate about is advocating against the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement where they can. And so some of that is on campuses because campuses tend to be a hotbed for boycott activity. Some of it is actually and this is particularly in southern states, is in state legislatures where there have either been in some state legislatures pro boycott legislation that Christian United for Israel has lobbied against. Or I'm thinking particularly of Arkansas. There's been legislation to sort of emphasize that that state will buy from Israel, sort of the reverse of a boycott. That Christian United for Israel has supported as well. So they're both on campus and in sort of other parts of our culture where these things are being debated actively right now.
Finally, we have our intersectional alliance working.
That's right.
But I do have one follow-up question. Why the South? Why are Southern states more likely to be in favor of BDS, right? If I understand you correctly.
Not that they're in favor of BDS, but that that's where Christians Unite for Israel and other pro-Israel evangelical groups have more
Mm.
influence because the culture in the South still is quite Protestant, conservative Protestant. Southern Baptists are very prominent, and so they tend to be able to influence state legislatures in the South to be more supportive of Israel or more against BDS than they do in other parts of the country, like New England or the West Coast, where even if you have some evangelicals, they tend to be way outnumbered by other interest groups.
Um, Jewish Zionism is based on the wish of Jewish people to fulfill biblical promises, to return to their historical homeland and to have a place where Jews can live safely as Jews and independently as Jews. What is the motivation for Christian Zionism? Could you further elaborate on that and for the support for Israel?
Yeah. There are there's diversity, as you might imagine, within the Christian Zionist world on this. We're talking about a lot of people. I tend to think about three sort of key arguments, and these are those theological, biblical arguments that Christian Zionists are making. The first is based on an understanding that God's intention for the Jewish people for eternity, you could say, or at least for the end state, is that they live in their homeland. So that's an interpretation of the biblical story. And within that, that the role of Gentiles is to help make that happen. And the key verse that Christian Zionists cite is in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, where God is talking to Abraham. This is when God's giving his covenant with Abraham. And he says in 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And so for Christian Zionists, this is a quite clear, transparent command by God to bless Abraham and his offspring. And if they don't, they're going to be cursed. So that's the first, and I would say that's the argument that unites the most Christian Zionists, actually around the globe. There's plenty of Christian Zionists that are outside of America. They all tend to rally around this idea that God will bless those who bless Israel, and that can turn into a somewhat creepy instrumental argument for supporting Israel, which we can get into, sort of one of the potential dark sides. But it is also an inspirational and you could say, an understanding of what it means to be a sort of supporter of a Judeo-Christian movement by seeing Gentiles and Jews working together to complete the redemptive history that God lays out in the Bible. So that's the first one is sort of that there will be a joint blessing happening if Christians support Israel and support the return of the Jewish people. The second one is the one that probably gets the most airtime, which is the end times beliefs of evangelical Christians in particular. Most of them, or at least a large subset of them, believe that the second coming of Jesus is going to happen sometime soon. And they think that there are a lot of things happening in the world right now that are going to lead up to that. And many of those things center in the Middle East and center on Israel. And in most versions of this view, there will be a lot of wars happening that Israel is involved in. There will be a false peace signed that will be sort of forced on Israel. That false peace will lead to a both a destruction of a lot of people in Israel, but also a miraculous saving of some people in Israel that will ultimately culminate in the Battle of Armageddon, which for these Christians will happen in Tel Megiddo in central Israel. And after that battle, Jesus will return and establish his kingdom in Jerusalem. Like Jerusalem will be the literal capital of that kingdom. So this is a very, we call it a literalist, futurist reading of biblical prophecy. Some of this comes out of the book of Revelation, which is, of course, only in the Christian parts of the Christian part of the New Testament. In the New Testament, there are other prophecies they draw from the book of Daniel, from the book of Jeremiah, from Zechariah, that would be shared texts with Jews, but Christians are interpreting these in their own way, linking up with other things they believe. So many Christian Zionists believe in this scenario and believe that their activity supporting Israel is helping sort of put the pieces in place for God to carry out the prophecies as they believe they've been prophesied in the Bible. I tend to be a little more skeptical that this is the fundamental reason why many Christians are active with the state of Israel. Part of that is because these beliefs have been around for a very long time. But it has only been recently, say in the last 50 years, that there has been a mass movement of evangelicals to become politically active on this. So something changed about 50 years ago that made a lot of people who believe this in the abstract want to believe it in a way that animated their politics. You also don't hear this reason cited by evangelicals. Many of them believe this, as I mentioned, but most of them don't cite the end time scenarios as why they support Israel. Now, you could think cynically that that's because it's just not strategic to talk about these things. Um, but you could also say that there's probably more going on than just these beliefs uh, behind why they're supporting Israel. Um, there's a debate about that, and in fact, I'm sure there's people across the spectrum on that. People who do actually want to see the end times happen as fast as possible, and that's why they're supporting Israel. Others who might believe this, but that's not really why they're doing it. And I will say there is a large minority of Christian Zionists who do not believe in this end time scenario. Particularly outside of the United States, this particular view of the end times is not that popular. And so there are other reasons why those Christians are supporting Israel. Some of them go back to the first reason we talked about. And then finally, I'll say the third reason is much more, when we're talking about America, much more about American culture than it is about Christianity. And that's that American evangelicals are American as much as they're evangelical. And there's a long history of American Zionism that transcends the Jewish community, that is about the shared cultural values between the U.S. and Israel, about the shared sort of pioneering origins of both countries, about the shared values of democracy and other sort of universal values. And evangelicals invoke those all the time as well. They, just like many other Americans, they identify with Israel because they see cultural similarity. So for many evangelicals, there's all three of these reasons sort of mixing together, and there's not clear divisions between them. But you can sort of identify distinctions also. Either they're referencing a certain biblical argument, they're referencing the end times, they're referencing these more secular or cultural values for why they support Israel. But you tend to see all three of those in a place like Christians Unite for Israel, deployed at different times depending on the audience they're trying to talk to.
And it goes deep, I think. It's important for Christians who are affiliated with this movement, I think. Is that correct?
It goes deep. Yes. For
Yes.
many of them, yes, this is core to what they think it means to be a Christian,
Yeah.
is to support Israel. That's where you really get into the group that is much more active on this. Like if they are going to see this as central to their Christian identity, yes, they see it as central as, living out the Beatitudes that Jesus teaches in the Gospel of Matthew. And they see it as, particularly in this moment, a really important part of their public witness for sort of standing up with Israel in its time of need. So yeah, you'll hear all that language when you get to the people who are sort of organizing their politics around Christian Zionism.
I'm going to ask a very basic question. We keep using the word evangelical throughout the whole program.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I tend to go with the most popular academic definition of evangelical. It has a really long name, I'm sorry, but it's called the Bebbington Quadrilateral. There is a Wikipedia entry on it, so you can just type in Bebbington Quadrilateral. David Bebbington is a British historian of evangelicalism. He coined the quadrilateral in the 1980s, so it's been around for a while. But his idea is that there's basically four things. That's where the quadrilateral part comes from. There's four things that make an evangelical as opposed to another type of Christian. And let me see if I can remember all four right now. But one of them is the centrality of the Bible. One of them is the centrality of the idea of a conversion being the sort of epitome of the religious life. And so you hear evangelicals often talk about the day they converted to Christianity or the day Jesus came into my life. It's a
Mm.
very evangelical way to speak.
But we're not
Uh,
talking about Jews converted.
no, right now we're just talking about any Christian who has the Bible at their center, who says they converted to Christianity, even if they grew up Christian.
Okay.
In the evangelical tradition, you must opt in. You must convert to sort of become a follower of Jesus. You're never born into it, and this is a distinctive mark of evangelicalism. A third is the centrality of the cross, Jesus dying on the cross, to the theology of evangelicalism. We call it cruciocentrism, but it's the idea that the sort of the climax of the life of Jesus was his death and resurrection, and that everything's different after that, basically, for evangelical Christians. And then the fourth one is missions or activism, as Bebbington called it, the idea that you're not supposed to just inherit your faith or even convert into your faith, but you're supposed to go out and make followers from others. All four of those are found in other parts of the Christian world, but where all four of them are found, you find evangelicals. And so that's a sort of abstract academic definition. What that means more in practice is there are certain denominations that are more evangelical. We mentioned Southern Baptists before; those tend to be very evangelical. I mean, there's a lot of denominations that have evangelical in the title, and that's a one giveaway that they're identifying like that. Many Presbyterians that are more conservative in their theology tend to be evangelical. And uh, you can find evangelicals also in the vast and growing non-denominational space. If you look at sort of sociology of where is American religion changing, it's in this non-denominational identity, which means they go to church, but their churches are not related institutionally to any other churches. It's actually about 20% of all Christians now in America go to those types of churches. Those are overwhelmingly evangelical churches. And a lot of the big pastors who are Christian Zionists who make the news tend to be pastors of large mega churches that are non-denominational, that
Who
are
are they?
who are they? So some of them are there's a famous pastor on the West Coast in Orange County called Greg Laurie, very sort of prominent. His sermons get tons of views on YouTube. His church has or I don't know if it's tens of thousands, but thousands of people that attend. His church is non-denominational. It has no denominational affiliation. One that does have a denominational affiliation, but is particularly significant, is Robert Jeffress, pastor of First Baptist Dallas. So it's a Baptist church, but very prominent. He's a very vocal supporter of Israel, and actually John Hagee, so the founder of Christians United for Israel, he has a church in San Antonio, Texas, which is quite large. It's called Cornerstone Church. It's non-denominational. It's not affiliated with any denomination. So these types of Christians are harder historically to place because almost until the 20th century, really, most Christians were in a denominational setting, and so you sort of say, oh yeah, those are Episcopalians, those are Methodists, those are Baptists. But part of the difference of the current moment is that a lot of these evangelical Christians now exist outside of that structure. So that it's harder to count them, but that is where a lot of the pro-Israel activity also happens, are in these non-denominational spaces.
Mhm. Is this relationship reciprocal from Israel? Is Israel supporting this community?
In some ways, they are, particularly from the political leadership. They have, and particularly under Netanyahu. Netanyahu's been a long time advocate of closer Christian Zionist Israel cooperation. So he's been on the scene for a long time. So he has certainly encouraged that. One distinctive political position of a lot of Christian Zionist organizations is they're quite supportive of the settlements in the West Bank and elsewhere. And so there are leaders out of that community that court Christian Zionist leadership pretty regularly. And Christian Zionists, and this goes all the way back. This isn't a new phenomenon. Back in the 1970s, a pretty famous Christian Zionist named Jerry Falwell in the 70s was supportive of the settler movement. This has been the really early moments of the settler movement in the 70s. He was supportive of it back then. So this has been a consistent sort of view. And then there are certain organizations that really do, Jewish organizations that really do court the support of Christians. Probably the most significant one is the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, which was founded by a modern Orthodox rabbi named Yechiel Eckstein. He's a Canadian. He passed away a few years ago. But the International Fellowship is one of the largest humanitarian organizations, certainly in this sort of sector. I think it's one of the largest that is actually active in Israel. And most of its money comes from American Christian Zionists. And they sent some millions over right after October 7th. Their budget is in the hundreds of millions. It's now run by Rabbi Eckstein's daughter, who is sort of stewarding that same relationship. But there is definitely a reciprocity there. I think in other areas, there is a skepticism by the Israeli public about what these Christians are up to, and what ultimately they want out of this relationship. And there's certainly a skepticism in the U.S. among a lot of American Jews and the evangelical community. And that's in part because on many other issues besides Israel, these two communities find themselves at opposite ends of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
And so there's just a skepticism. Frankly, the skepticism goes both ways. But there's certainly a skepticism by American Jews about getting at all close to, really conservative evangelical Christians. The end times stuff weirds them out, but also the evangelicals' views on all types of issues seem to be at odds with how American Jews see the world.
So with that really fascinating conclusion, I think that is the conclusion of what we'd like to talk about today. I think that this is an amazing conversation. I think you have explained it very complicated in a way that I think a lot of people who didn't really understand before can now understand, or at least try to understand. So I want to thank you for everything that you've been doing. I want to thank you for coming on the show. I want to thank our listeners. Those of you who want to know more about Evelyn and myself, go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeart, and speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate whenever you can.